Well, hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Beeley, the director of the Anglican Episcopal House of Studies. It's my great pleasure today to bring you an interview with my friend and colleague, Luke Bretherton. Dr. Bretherton is the Cushman Professor of Moral and Political Theology at Duke Divinity School and the author of the recently published Christ and the Common Life. And we're going to chat together today about his new book. So Luke, first, congratulations on the book. Wonderful accomplishment, and it's been great to hear several conversations about it already. So congratulations and thanks for.
Thank you. I'll hold up said volume. It's really a delight to be talking to you.
Yeah, so this book is a great accomplishment, Luke, and it does several things all in one cover. Tell us the main things that the book is setting out to do, and how you see that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a kind of central premise of the book is really trying to give a theological account of politics. And so the kind of vision I set out of politics is politics as the negotiation of a common life between competing visions of the good and asymmetries of power. And that can sound a bit complicated, but I think one of the kind of central emphases of the book is that we often think about politics purely in terms of party politics or in terms of what the state does. And what I'm trying to tease out is that is one aspect of politics and a very important bit of politics, and a bit of politics that the Anglican Episcopal tradition, obviously because of kind of alignment with the state, has been very focused on. But it's not the only bit of politics. There's also politics as a kind of relational set of practices for negotiating a common life outside of any reference to the state. So whether that's neighbors sorting out a noise dispute without calling the police, if they call to the police, that's a move then to involve the state or law as the means of kind of reconciling difference and navigating a common life. So we can look at nomads in the desert, navigating access to a water hole as a form of politics through mechanisms of hospitality. What goes on in a church? Should we take the pews out? Should we keep them in? That's a form of politics. And so in that form of politics, there's power, but it's relational power and not so much the kind of unilateral command and control forms of power that is often the kind of central focus of a lot of thinking about politics. And in that respect, I'm trying to think through a theology of a kind of holistic vision of politics that involves both the relational and the unilateral. And then how different traditions, whether that's Pentecostal tradition, Catholic social teaching, Anglicanism, Black power and Black liberation theology, have come to understand politics, and in particular, why and how in the modern period we see the church in all its forms, and it is all its forms, turning to democracy as the kind of ideal or normative form of politics, and why democracy becomes the way in which the church kind of metabolizes the emergence of the modern world, from industrialization to the emergence of capitalism, to the emergence of the nation state, bureaucratization, et cetera, these kind of processes of modernization. And so in various chapters, I kind of look through how different traditions come to understand democracy and what their particular vision of politics is. And then in kind of part two, I look at particular issues that shape or inhibit a modern life. So I look at tolerance, and kind of conflict between traditions. I look at class, and then the third part of the book is really an account of a kind of constructive political theology of democracy for the kind of contemporary moment, and addresses particular issues like sovereignty, the nature of the people, and populism, and those kinds of things. So it's that sense of what do we understand by politics, how does democratic politics play into that? And then how do different Christian traditions kind of come to practice and understand that in themselves. And here's a slightly different approach to a lot of approaches to political theology, which begin with kind of school, so a liberation theology or whatever. I'm trying to think about living traditions like Anglicanism, like Pentecostalism, and how do actually people working within those traditions see politics, and then in particular see democratic politics.
Great. Tell us a little bit about how your Anglican, the Anglican part of your background, how does that inform this work?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a cradle-born Anglican, but grew up in a slightly strange house. In that my parents were very ecumenically engaged and formed very much out of the charismatic movement from the 1970s as well. So we would kind of go along to Orthodox Easter. My mother had a great friend who was Russian Orthodox and joined their services. And then as part of the early charismatic renewal movement in England at that time, was very much an ecumenical movement. So praying with Catholic nuns was always a source of great delight to my parents. And so that sense of a kind of drawing on different parts of the tradition and Anglicanism being very much Catholic and Reformed, and yet also infused with a kind of living sense of the Spirit's presence, whether that was present in the sacraments or present in kind of gifts of the Spirit and healing and this kind of thing, kind of classic kind of charismatic gifts, and both of those being treasured. And so that Anglicanism became a way for me to hold those together. And a third dimension to that, my parents were very involved in, it ran out of our front room actually for 15 years, housing association. And that was born out of seeing the first generation of Afro-Caribbean migrants come to the UK to work in London, and the racism they confronted in housing and the way they were treated and terrible treatment by slum landlords as in the late 60s, early 70s. And so my parents set up this housing association through the church to provide good quality housing to low-income families, and particularly for folk coming from Jamaica and Trinidad and elsewhere. And so that sense of how the church was engaged in forms of what we might now call social justice, but in a very practical, real-world way, and how you had this kind of sacramental sense and this kind of Pentecostal sense. That profoundly shaped me, and kind of, you can hear some of that in the book, where I kind of trying to think through how political theology is as much a discernment of spirits as it is a kind of negotiation of the practicalities of asymmetries of power and the like. Also, just go back to just the Anglican piece, because I think one of the things I didn't say was, that's important, is one of my frustrations. I read a lot of accounts of Anglican political theology, broadly could be often framed as Anglican social theology, and they tended to either emphasize one aspect or another. So we tended to either get really, it was a kind of Anglo-Catholic Christian socialism story, that was the key story, and then there was this problematic evangelicalism, or you got a kind of evangelicalism is the true thing, and there's kind of reformed elements, and really these terrible kind of wastrels over here doing this kind of Anglo-Catholic Christian socialism thing. And you know, that was a kind of overly baptizing the world. And I've always found, I've never been very satisfied with the kind of accounts of Anglican political thought that I've kind of read. And so part of what I'm trying to have a particular chapter on Anglicanism, and part of what I'm trying to do in that is trying to give a kind of fuller account that holds both kind of William Wilberforce and F.D. Maurice, both John Stott and Desmond Tutu, both Hannah More and Vida Scudder or Pauline Murray. And so that each of these, we've got a multifaceted tradition that is a kind of an argument over time about a particular understanding of what faithful political witness involves. And so that's part of what I'm trying to lay out. And I think that's very important in this current moment, obviously with the kind of divisions in Anglicanism worldwide, is to give these readings that show how these can be read together, not in oppositional terms, but as a kind of shared conversation that itself together curates something of the spirit of Anglicanism.
Mm. Yeah, it's apropos for the current moment, isn't it? As we're in an extended Lambeth year now, into 2021, right? We've got another year to work on all this.
And I think, yeah, and exactly, the Lambeth moment is a great reference, because one of the things I think has been a failure, and I'll own this in those of us who teach Christian ethics, we tend to view politics as a failure, or conflict as a failure. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And part of, I hope, is the point of the book, is to say, look, there will always be conflict. We will have disagreement about how to live out this vision of the good. That conflict, as finite fallen creatures, conflict is inevitable. The question is the quality and character through and the ways we go about sustaining and navigating a common life, and that's politics. And so we need a constructive vision of politics as part of the cure of souls, rather than we do the cure of souls over here and then we have to engage and get our hands dirty in politics. No. Politics is part of discipleship. We learn things in politics, whether intra-ecclesial politics or in the navigation of a common life with those not like us. We learn things about who God is and who we are in relation to God through politics. And if we don't engage in politics and engage in the kind of quality and character of relations necessary to engage in a faithful, hopeful, loving politics, we're failing to learn deep theological truths at a kind of experiential and cognitive level. And so that I think is really a kind of central thrust of the book, is this sense of we can't cultivate theological imaginations and Christian discipleship outside of politics. And when we pathologize politics or give it over to Machiavelli as its true spokesperson, we're cutting ourselves off from a vital arena in which we learn important things about who we are in relation to God and each other.
Well, that's such a rich vision and a fertile prospect. I mean, it seems to me that analogously, it can really serve to open us to the great reach of the gospel, where God, out of love, decided to become the totally other, right, in order to save us. But so often we close our own hearts and close ourselves off to one another, as you're describing, and even to ourselves. And so what a great kind of opening vision that is, that I think really mirrors the basic pattern of the gospel. So it's really rich. Let me ask you one final question from the other side. So what would you hope that people in the world, people who aren't Christian, would come to see in the church in light of this kind of theological politics?
So I think it's a great question. I think there's a sense in which, because of the ways in which politics is dominated by kind of party politics and ideological divisions, and then the kind of role of the state in all of this, broader questions about the meaning and purpose of politics, and questions of virtue, what kind of person do I need to be in order to do politics well, i.e. faithfully, hopefully, lovingly. I think it would be wonderful, and the church, I think, has a real contribution to make, to break open the imminent horizon and say, actually, politics in this kind of penultimate worldly setting is not all there is. It's not the last word. There is a word beyond this word. And so questions of politics and economics don't determine the meaning and purpose of life. In fact, they must serve the meaning and purpose of life. And when life is meant to serve economics and politics, we have forms of kind of totalization or even totalitarianism, which means that the human is subordinated to the political and economic. And that, going back to what I said earlier, I think that is a central move in all traditions coming through the 19th century and into the 20th century, was realizing in the modern world the huge power of the state and the market to determine life, and in a sense to reduce the human to either an administrative unit of the state, even in social democratic kind of setups, and then of the market to reduce the human simply to a commodity, and the ways in which this undermines human flourishing. Obviously, at a macro scale, we see that in terms of kind of ecological crisis, but even at a kind of the reduction of male-female relations to sex and in the pornographic or whatever. At all levels, we see the commodification and the instrumentalization of life as such. And so I think that sense in which you can't reduce life to politics and economics, there's always a word beyond it, and that we need horizons of reference, transcendent horizons of reference, to ensure that life itself isn't subordinated to the political and to the economic. And I think that's a tough fight. It's always been the fight. And that's a struggle that I think Christians can find allies with, and be a kind of reminder to not to kind of collapse everything into politics and economics.
Mm. That's a struggle we may be engaged in for a very long time. An eschatological struggle even, yes.
Indeed.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for taking time, and it's stimulating and exciting to talk about the book. Congratulations again. Maybe you can hold it up for us again. This is Luke Bretherton, Christ and the Common Life, brought to you from Duke Divinity School. Blessings to all for a rich common life in the hope of the risen Christ and his return.
Amen.